Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into an incredibly complex and profoundly significant topic.
Absolutely. It's a heavy one.
It really is. Our source material for this exploration is this comprehensive report. It's titled The Triad of Annihilation: Genocide in Palestine.
And it's quite a detailed document.
It is. Now, this isn't just, a timeline of events. The report meticulously builds a case, arguing that what's currently unfolding is, in its analysis, a genocide.
A term that carries immense weight.
Exactly. And it's a characterization that, as the report makes very clear, is shared by numerous human rights organizations, UN experts, and a growing number of legal scholars.
Yeah, that consensus is something the report really highlights.
Right. The report's core claim is that these events aren't random or, isolated incidents.
No, it frames them as systemic.
Precisely. Driven by interlocking systems, what it calls a triad of forces. It breaks these down into three main pillars.
Okay.
First, the underlying psychological mechanisms, sort of the mindsets that enable mass atrocities.
How people get there.
Exactly. Second, the specific far-right ideology in Israel that, according to this report's analysis, provides the justification and the directive for these actions.
The political engine, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And third, international complicity, particularly from the United States, providing crucial material and diplomatic support, basically enabling the scale of operations.
So psychology, ideology, and external support. That's the triad.
That's the triad they lay out.
Yeah.
And in terms of how they built this case, their methodology, the report synthesizes a really wide array of sources.
It draws from quite a few places, doesn't it?
It really does. We're talking peer-reviewed academic journals, psychology, political science, official reports from UN bodies, international human rights organizations.
Standard sources for this kind of analysis?
Right. Detailed legal analyses.
Yeah.
And investigative journalism, too. The explicit goal here, as the report states, is to connect complex theory with real-world policy and law.
Trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, illuminating this, devastating convergence of factors.
It's crucial work.
And it's vital for us, right here at the start, to acknowledge the gravity of that term, genocide.
Absolutely. It's not a word to be used lightly.
Definitely not. And this report doesn't. It rigorously adheres to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide.
The foundational legal text.
Exactly. Which defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. The definition is key.
The intent element is critical.
It is. And a pivotal point the report highlights, something central to its argument, is that the International Court of Justice, the ICJ,
The World Court.
yes, has already found a plausible risk of genocide occurring.
Which is a very significant legal finding.
Hugely significant. And as the report meticulously details, this finding carries profound legal implications for all states involved, particularly regarding the duty to prevent genocide.
It puts everyone on notice, legally speaking.
It does. Now, our mission here on the Deep Dive, as always, is to impartially present the report's content. We're focusing on conveying the ideas, the findings, the arguments from the source material.
Just laying out what the report says.
Exactly. This isn't about us endorsing specific viewpoints, but about understanding the detailed analysis presented in this, frankly, vital document, allowing you, our listener, to draw your own conclusions based on the evidence and arguments laid out.
Sounds like the right approach.
So, with that framework in mind, let's jump in.
Okay.
The report opens by tackling this really profound question. How do societies, how do people reach a point where they can inflict such devastation? It talks about something called the psychological architecture of eliminationist violence. Can you help us understand what the report means by that and why it's, so critical to this discussion?
Absolutely. The report's central argument here is that genocide isn't, some spontaneous explosion of hate.
It's not sudden.
No, not usually. Instead, it's presented as a deeply complex process, one that's enabled by specific psychological mechanisms. It really digs into how ordinary individuals and even entire societies can gradually become complicit in, or maybe just indifferent to, destruction on an almost unimaginable scale.
That's a powerful and maybe unsettling idea. So what are some of these key psychological mechanisms the report identifies? What are we talking about here?
Well, one of the most foundational concepts the report discusses is moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement.
Yeah. This is basically how perpetrators, or even bystanders, overcome their fundamental human inhibitions against harming others. They do this by selectively deactivating their moral self-sanctions.
So like switching off their conscience temporarily.
In a way, yes. Think of it as a set of cognitive maneuvers, mental tricks, if you like, designed to make destructive actions seem acceptable or maybe even necessary.
An internal rewiring almost. What are some of these specific maneuvers the report mentions?
Precisely. The report details several. First, there's moral justification. This reframes destructive actions as serving some higher, perhaps even noble purpose.
Okay, like finding a good reason for doing bad things.
Exactly. So in the Israeli context, the report notes how military operations in Gaza, despite their devastating impact on civilians, have been consistently presented by officials as essential acts of self-defense or counterterrorism.
Right.
This framing, the report argues, helps morally disengage both the direct perpetrators, like soldiers, and the wider society that supports or accepts the actions.
Makes sense. What else?
Another maneuver is euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language to mask the severity of actions.
Like collateral damage instead of civilian deaths.
Exactly like that. Or neutralizing targets instead of killing people. It creates distance. And then there's advantageous comparison.
How does that work?
It's making one's own actions seem benign or less harmful by contrasting them with even worse theoretical conduct. Well, at least we're not doing X, Y, or Zs.
Ah, okay. Sort of grading on a curve of atrocity.
Kind of, yeah. The report emphasizes how all this framing creates a psychological distance, a buffer, from the actual reality of the violence being inflicted.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the report connects this moral disengagement to something called group narcissism, correct? How does that amplify things?
Yes, that's a key connection the report makes. It argues that moral disengagement is significantly amplified by group narcissism.
And this isn't just individual ego, right? It's collective.
Exactly. It's a collective belief in a group's innate superiority, its grandiosity, and a profound sense of entitlement. A group caught up in this often feels, chosen.
Chosen by God or destiny or...
Could be either, or just a sense of inherent specialness. And because of that, the group perceives itself as uniquely entitled to special rights, maybe even exempt from the rules that govern other groups.
Okay. And the impact of that?
Well, the profound impact, as the report details it, is a significant lack of empathy for outgroups. Their suffering, even their destruction, can become insignificant if it's seen as serving the in-group's power, glory, or perceived security.
Can you elaborate on how the report applies this specifically to the Israeli context? It seems like a sensitive application.
It is, and the report treads carefully but directly. It applies this concept to the narrative of Jewish history, particularly focusing on the collective trauma of the Holocaust, HaShoah.
The never again principle.
Right. The report argues that this incredibly deep trauma has, at times, been instrumentalized within parts of Israeli society to foster this kind of group narcissism. The idea of being the eternal victim, coupled with a belief that the whole world is against us, can perhaps paradoxically fuel a sense of moral superiority and entitlement.
That's a complex psychological dynamic.
Very. And the report then introduces this really interesting concept it calls power dysmorphia.
Power dysmorphia, what's that?
It's used to describe what the report sees as a profound distortion of power perception. Essentially, a nuclear-armed state, one with arguably one of the world's most advanced militaries,
Right.
genuinely perceives itself as perpetually vulnerable, perhaps existentially threatened, by a largely unarmed, stateless people.
So a powerful entity feeling perpetually weak or victimized.
That's the idea. This psychological paradox, the report argues, helps explain some of the, what are seen as disproportionate responses and the framing of adversaries as existential threats, however outmatched they might objectively be.
Right.
It creates this state of hypervigilance.
Where any resistance feels like a major threat.
Exactly, justifying extreme measures in response. It really helps connect the dots, as the report suggests.
Okay, that truly helps frame the psychological landscape. The report then transitions to examining how these psychological ideas manifest in real-world actions.
Mm-hmm.
And it offers some really stark examples, particularly through what it calls the critical precondition for genocide, dehumanization.
Yes, dehumanization is presented as absolutely central.
The report highlights it as defining a group as, less than human, the classic tropes. Animals, insects, monsters.
Vermin, disease.
Right. Thereby removing them from the moral circle, the fear of those who deserve basic human consideration and protection. This cognitive shift, the report argues, makes it not only permissible, but in the perpetrator's mind, potentially righteous to harm and even eliminate the dehumanized group.
It breaks that fundamental connection of shared humanity.
Exactly. And the report provides some chilling rhetorical examples directly from Israeli leadership, particularly since October 7th, 2023.
These quotes are quite jarring.
They really are. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, for instance, on October 9th, 2023, declared a complete siege on Gaza, stating, and this is a direct quote the report emphasizes, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly."
Explicitly framing them as subhuman.
Explicitly. The report views this as a direct categorization of 2.3 million people as subhuman, which then directly justifies, in that mindset, cutting off their food, water, and electricity.
It provides the rationale.
It does. Similarly, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu invoked the biblical command to remember what Amalek has done to you.
Which has a very specific and violent historical context in the text.
Extremely violent. It references a command to utterly destroy an enemy nation, including men and women, children and infants. The report emphasizes how such rhetoric functions as a clear signal, a green light almost, that the normal rules of engagement, the normal moral constraints, do not apply to the targeted group.
It lifts the barriers to extreme violence.
And it also references scholarly studies looking back at the 2014 Gaza war, which found extreme and comparable levels of blatant dehumanization in both Israeli and Palestinian community samples. And crucially, this dehumanization was uniquely associated with support for aggressive actions, even things like torture.
So it's not just words, it connects directly to supporting violence.
That's the link the report draws. And what's particularly alarming, as the report details, is how this sort of long-standing rhetorical dehumanization has now been fused, really integrated with advanced technology.
The AI systems.
Yes. It describes the Israeli military's use of artificial intelligence targeting systems as a qualitative shift, almost, in the practice of moral disengagement, moving it beyond just the individual soldier or pilot.
Right. The report analyzes specific AI systems mentioned in investigations. Gospel, for instance, which targets infrastructure.
Okay.
But then there's Lavender. This system identifies suspected militants for assassination. And the report cites these investigations, plus 972 magazine and Local Call, notably, revealing Lavender reportedly generated a kill list of up to 37,000 Palestinians.
37,000 potential targets identified by AI.
Yes. And with a pre-authorized allowance, apparently, for killing 15 to 20 civilians as collateral damage for each junior operative targeted.
15 to 20 civilians per target. That's staggering.
That's a shocking ratio, if accurate. And even more disturbing, perhaps, is a system reportedly named Where's Daddy?
Where's Daddy? What did that do?
According to the sources cited, it was used to track individuals and signal for an airstrike specifically when they entered their family homes.
Targeting them when they were with their families.
Effectively ensuring the killing of entire families alongside the individual target. That's the implication described.
That is truly chilling. So the report argues this isn't just about military efficiency, finding targets faster.
Yeah.
It's something more profound psychologically.
That's exactly right. The report's analysis here delves deeply into what it terms the industrialization of moral disengagement.
Industrialization.
Yeah. It argues that these AI systems essentially operationalize the dehumanizing rhetoric. They take the statement, they are human animals, and turn it into a military process that treats them as data points, not people.
Reducing humans to targets on a screen?
Precisely. Humans, families, entire communities are reduced to data points in a system. This creates a deep psychological and technological buffer between the person pushing the button maybe miles away and the actual act of killing.
Taking the human element out of the decision.
It strips it away. The decision to end a life becomes potentially a technical or bureaucratic function, almost devoid of its moral weight. This, the report concludes, creates a dangerous self-reinforcing cycle.
How so?
The dehumanizing rhetoric justifies the development and use of this kind of technology. And the technology, in turn, normalizes the lethal consequences, making it seem cleaner, more detached, which further entrenches the moral disengagement. It feeds itself.
Wow. Okay. Building on that, the report connects these psychological mechanisms to deeper historical wounds. It describes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a kind of crucible of competing traumas.
Yes, this is a really important layer of the analysis.
Can you explain what these foundational traumas are as the report lays them out and how it analyzes their interplay?
Of course. The report really delves into the foundational traumas that shape both national consciousnesses, the core narratives. For Israeli Jews, there's the Holocaust, Hashoah.
The systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany.
Right. An almost unimaginable horror that serves as the bedrock never again rationale for the existence and security of a Jewish state. It's a profound historical wound that shapes national identity, security perceptions, everything.
And for Palestinians.
For Palestinians, there's the Nakba al-Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. This involved the expulsion, the forced displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and lands, and the destruction of hundreds of their villages during the establishment of Israel.
Two immense defining national tragedies.
Exactly. And both are perceived by their respective peoples as paramount tragedies, forming the moral and political justification for their ongoing struggles and claims.
And the report points to a dynamic between these traumas.
Yes, a central psychological dynamic the report illuminates is what it calls the otherization of suffering.
Otherization of suffering.
It's where each side's embrace of its own victimhood narrative often seems predicated on minimizing or sometimes even denying the reality or significance of the other's suffering.
Like a zero-sum game of victimhood.
Pretty much. It creates this tragic competition for the status of the ultimate victim. And in that competition, expressing empathy for the other can almost feel like a betrayal of one's own people, a negation of their historical pain.
Which makes mutual recognition incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible sometimes. This dynamic, as the report points out, effectively forecloses pathways toward mutual understanding and tragically perpetuates cycles of violence and mistrust.
So these traumas aren't just passive historical memories, they're actively used in the present.
Exactly. That's a key argument. The report highlights how these collective traumas are not merely passive historical memories. They are actively curated, shaped, and deployed as political instruments by leaders on both sides.
How so? Give us an example.
Well, the Holocaust, for instance. The report argues it's frequently instrumentalized by Israeli leaders to frame any form of Palestinian resistance or even just Palestinian national aspirations as an existential threat, often by drawing direct parallels.
Like comparing Palestinians to Nazis or Amalek.
Precisely. Like Prime Minister Netanyahu's Amalek reference we discussed earlier. This rhetorical move, the report argues, transforms a genuine historical trauma into a justification for present-day aggression and suspicion. It creates this state of hypervigilance, making peace seem naive or dangerous. And for Palestinians, how is the Nakba framed? For Palestinians, the trauma of the Nakba, as described in the report, is often presented not just as a past event, but as a continuous, ongoing reality.
Because of the occupation, settlements, etc.
Exactly. It's experienced daily through the ongoing military occupation, the relentless expansion of illegal settlements, home demolitions, land confiscation, the siege of Gaza, the denial of basic rights. This isn't just memory, it's lived experience.
Creating ongoing trauma.
Yes, what some experts cited call ongoing traumatic threat. This transgenerational trauma, compounded by repeated military assaults, particularly in Gaza, creates this constant sense of insecurity and loss. But it also fuels a powerful narrative of resistance and sumud.
Sumud.
Steadfastness. It's this idea of enduring resilience, holding on to the land and identity despite immense pressure. The report concludes that this devastating cycle of hurt people hurting people is tragically exploited by extremists on both sides. They feed off each other's actions and rhetoric. Each atrocity committed by one side provides justification and fuel for the other's extremism, ensuring the conflict remains intractable. Trauma, in this context, gets transformed from something that could potentially be a source of shared human vulnerability into a political commodity, a weapon used to deepen divisions and justify eliminationist politics.
That's a truly bleak analysis of the psychological landscape underpinning the conflict.
It paints a difficult picture, for sure.
So, okay, with these deep psychological currents identified, what does the report tell us about how a specific political ideology then moved from the fringes right into the heart of the Israeli government? The current actions, as the report explains them, aren't just reactions to October 7th. They're framed as the culmination of a long-term political project of the Israeli far right.
Right. The report offers a really compelling historical trajectory here. It connects these past ideological influences directly to the present political landscape in Israel. It traces the origins of the modern Israeli right back to revisionist Zionism.
Revisionist Zionism. Who started that?
A figure named Zev Jabotinsky back in the 1920s. Now, unlike the mainstream labor Zionism of that era, which was more socialist-oriented.
Right, the kibbutz movement and all that.
Exactly. Revisionist Zionism was explicitly ultranationalist and militaristic from the start. Its core tenet was Jabotinsky's Iron Wall doctrine.
The Iron Wall, what did that mean?
It basically posited that a Jewish state in Palestine could only be established and secured through the application of overwhelming, unwavering military force against the indigenous Arab population. Any compromise was seen as weakness.
Force was the only language they'd understand, essentially.
That was the core belief, as the report lays it out. Only superior Jewish military might could guarantee the Zionist project's success. This was a stark contrast to the more conciliatory or at least pragmatic approaches favored by other Zionist factions at the time.
And the report suggests this ideology didn't develop in a vacuum. It drew inspiration from elsewhere.
Indeed. The report meticulously documents what it describes as a profound influence from the rising tide of right-wing nationalism and, frankly, fascism in Europe during the 1920s and 30s.
Really? Direct influence from European fascism.
The report cites historical research suggesting direct links. Early revisionist movements and their leaders reportedly saw Benito Mussolini's regime in Italy not just as a potential ally against the British, but even as a kind of model for a future disciplined, militarized Jewish state.
That's quite a connection.
It is. And a particularly militant faction within the movement, the revisionist maximalists, led by a figure named Abba Ahimer, openly embraced totalitarian and fascist principles. Their stated aim, as the report quotes, was to extract revisionism from its liberal entrapment.
Meaning?
Meaning they wanted to shed any democratic or liberal pretenses. They sought to elevate Jabotinsky to the status of a dictator, an authoritarian leader, with the explicit goal of creating a Jewish state based on fascist principles and the forcible assimilation or control of the Palestinian population.
Wow. So these ideas were there quite early on.
Very early. And from this ideological milieu emerged paramilitary organizations, the most famous being the Irgun and the even more extreme Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang.
These were the groups fighting the British and Arabs before Israel's establishment.
Correct. They engaged in acts of terrorism against both the British Mandate authorities and Palestinian civilians. The Irgun, led for a time by Menachem Begin, who, remember, later became Prime Minister of Israel.
Right, that's a crucial link.
Yes. The Irgun was responsible for major attacks like the King David Hotel bombing and the Deir Yassin massacre. The Lehi went even further, according to the report's sources, attempting to form a military alliance with Nazi Germany against the British.
Alliance with Nazi Germany, that seems counterintuitive.
It's shocking, but the logic reported was, the enemy of my enemy is my friend against the British. They proposed a Jewish state based on nationalist and totalitarian principles.
And the report draws a line from these groups to today.
It draws a direct line. It highlights that the Irgun was later absorbed into the newly formed Israeli military, the IDF, and its leaders formed the Herut Party. Herut is the direct political predecessor of today's Likud Party, Netanyahu's party.
So Likud grew out of the Irgun's political wing.
Essentially, yes. This historical link, the report argues, is crucial. It establishes that supremacist, anti-democratic, and even fascist-adjacent thought wasn't just a brief flirtation, but has deep identifiable roots within a significant stream of the Zionist movement. It wasn't just a fringe element that disappeared.
It underscores a continuous thread of thought, then.
That's the argument. It wasn't a recent or alien intrusion into Israeli politics, but something with a long pedigree.
Okay. This historical lineage then leads us to the next critical development the report describes, the evolution of this ideology into an even more virulent form, the Kahanist doctrine.
Right, Rabbi Meir Kahan.
Yes. In the latter half of the 20th century, Kahan synthesized these revisionist ideas, particularly the most extreme parts, into a coherent and, well, extremely virulent religious ideology. Kahanism, the doctrine he founded, represents arguably the most extreme expression of Jewish supremacy within Israeli politics.
It's explicitly racist in its tenets.
Can you break down Kahanism's core tenets as the report details them? What does it actually advocate?
Its core tenets, which Kani claimed were drawn from an ultra-conservative interpretation of Jewish law, or halacha, are explicitly racist and theocratic. Kahanism envisions an Israeli state where non-Jews, particularly Arabs, are stripped of their rights. Intermarriage would be prohibited. The state's ultimate purpose in this view is to serve the Jewish people exclusively, even through acts of revenge against perceived enemies.
And the most infamous part.
The most infamous plank is undoubtedly the call for the forcible expulsion, the transfer of Palestinians and other non-Jews from the entirety of what Kahanists considered the biblical land of Israel, which includes the occupied territories.
Expulsion. And what about those who refuse to leave?
According to Kahanist doctrine, those who refuse would be relegated to a status of permanent subjugation, perhaps as resident aliens, but certainly without citizenship or voting rights, second-class status, or worse.
Kahan actually formed a political party, Kosh, right? It even got into the Knesset for a while.
It did, briefly, but it was so overtly racist that it was eventually banned from running for the Knesset in 1988 under anti-racism laws.
And later designated a terrorist organization.
Yes, by both Israel and the United States, particularly after one of Kahan's followers, an American-Israeli doctor named Baruch Goldstein, walked into the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron in 1994 during prayers and massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers. Goldstein was a known Koch supporter.
A truly horrific event.
Absolutely. But, and this is crucial to the report's argument, the banning of Koch did not eradicate its ideology.
It just went underground, or to the fringes.
Exactly. Instead, Kahanism became a potent source of inspiration for a new generation of far-right extremists. While the original Kahan organization became inactive, the core ideas, Jewish supremacy, segregation, the desirability of expelling Palestinians persisted and festered, particularly within the settler movement in the West Bank and on the far-right political fringe.
And this evolved into the neo-Kahanist movement.
That's the term the report uses. This neo-Kahanist movement would eventually find its way back into the political mainstream, most prominently through the party Otzma Yehudit.
Otzma Yehudit means Jewish power.
Yes. And its leaders, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, proudly claim to be the ideological successors to Khan and Kaf. So the ideology wasn't defeated by the ban, it just adapted and waited for an opportunity to reemerge into mainstream politics.
That's the crucial point, isn't it? Which raises the big question. How did these once fringe, even banned ideologies become so central? How did they get back into government?
Well, the report argues very strongly that this transition wasn't accidental. It wasn't just drift. It was actively facilitated, even orchestrated, by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Netanyahu facilitated it. Why?
According to the report's analysis, primarily for reasons of political expediency and, frankly, personal survival, especially as he faced multiple corruption indictments.
So staying in power was the main driver.
That's the argument. Over his long periods in power, Netanyahu found it increasingly difficult to form stable governing coalitions with centrist or traditional right-wing parties. His primary objective, the report contends, became forming any government that would grant him power and potentially shield him from prosecution, perhaps through legislative changes.
So he essentially needed votes from anywhere he could get them, and the far right was available.
Exactly. To achieve this parliamentary majority in Israel's complex coalition system, Netanyahu strategically turned to the religious and ultranationalist far right. He recognized that their voter base, though maybe smaller in overall numbers, was fiercely loyal and absolutely essential for getting him over the line to form a government.
So he acted as their political broker, almost.
Precisely. The report details how he actively worked to bring them into the fold. He orchestrated mergers and alliances among the various small, far-right parties to ensure they would collectively cross the 3.25% electoral threshold needed to enter the Knesset as a unified bloc. If they ran separately, they might not make it in.
Making sure their votes weren't wasted.
Exactly. This strategy culminated most notably in the creation of the Religious Zionism Party Alliance ahead of the 2022 election. This alliance brought together Kahanist-inspired politicians like Ben-Gvir with other ultranationalists like Bezalel Smotrich, effectively making them kingmakers. They held the balance of power.
And the report describes this as a symbiotic relationship. What was the trade-off?
It was clearly symbiotic, according to the analysis. The far-right parties provided Netanyahu with the Knesset seats he desperately needed to stay in power and potentially navigate his legal challenges. In return, he gave them unprecedented legitimacy, bringing them into government and, crucially, control over key, powerful government ministries: national security, finance, influence over the West Bank.
Positions where they could enact their agenda.
Directly. And concurrently, the report argues, Netanyahu's own political platform and rhetoric shifted dramatically further to the right. He increasingly adopted the far-right's agenda and language as his own.
Can you give examples?
Well, he championed the controversial 2018 nation-state law, which constitutionally enshrines Jewish supremacy over other citizens and demotes the status of Arabic. That was a key demand of the right.
signaling a shift in the state's identity.
Absolutely. He also embraced populist rhetoric, attacking the judiciary, the media, law enforcement, calling them a deep state elite conspiring against him, and the will of the people language, very familiar from other right-wing populist leaders globally.
Undermining democratic institutions.
That's the effect, the report argues, and perhaps most concretely, he advanced plans for the formal annexation of large parts of the occupied West Bank, a long-held dream of the settler movement and the far right. So through these actions, Netanyahu did more than just form a coalition with the far right. The report suggests he effectively merged much of his Likud party's agenda with theirs, mainstreaming ideologies that had for decades been considered beyond the pale of acceptable political discourse in Israel.
So in a way, the democratic system itself, the need for coalition partners, was leveraged to bring in fundamentally anti-democratic ideologies.
Precisely. The report views this whole process as demonstrating a profound vulnerability within parliamentary democracies like Israel's. It shows how the mechanics of coalition bargaining and raw electoral math can be exploited by a leader, particularly one perhaps motivated by self-preservation, to install an ideology that is fundamentally anti-democratic, maybe even eliminationist in its aims.
They did need a coup.
No coup needed. The democratic system itself, under a leader willing to make that bargain, became the vehicle for their ascent. They are now, as the report puts it, attempting to transform the state from within, using their ministerial power and legislative influence to solidify their position and implement their agenda through official channels.
That's a powerful and deeply concerning trajectory described there. So what does this all mean for the current government, the one formed after those 2022 elections, and its policies? The report provides a deep dive into what it calls the anatomy of the 37th government, the coalition of extremes.
Yes, this government, formed by Netanyahu in December 2022, has been widely described, not just by this report, but by many analysts, as the most right-wing, most religious, and most extremist in Israel's entire history.
And it's built directly on the ideologies we've just discussed, right? It brings together Netanyahu's increasingly nationalist Likud party with ultra-Orthodox parties who have their own agenda, and this block of far-right religious Zionists, the ideological heirs to Kahanism.
That's the composition. The inclusion of figures like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in very senior cabinet positions, the report argues, represents the culmination of their decades-long journey from the political wilderness, from being banned terrorists even, to the very center of state power.
And the report stresses that their extremist platforms aren't just talk. They're becoming policy.
That's the core argument of this section. It's not merely rhetoric anymore. Their stated goals and ideologies are being translated directly into state policy, with potentially devastating consequences, not only for Palestinians, but also for the democratic character, or what remains of it, of the Israeli state itself. The report even includes a table, a kind of rogues gallery, if you will, outlining key far-right figures in the current Israeli government, their positions, their documented ideologies, and some of their most inflammatory statements. It really illustrates the direct link between extremist thought and state power.
Let's look at some of those examples the report provides. Obviously, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, from Likud. The report frames him as the key facilitator of the far-right's rise. It mentions his promotion of West Bank annexation, the nation-state law, his populist anti-deep state rhetoric, and it flags that quote to soldiers. You must remember what Amalek has done to you, and his active orchestration of the far-right alliances to maintain his own power. His role was pivotal, the report argues.
He's presented as the enabler-in-chief.
Then there's Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of National Security from Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power. The report states he explicitly embodies Kahanist ideology. He advocates for arming settlers, expanding police powers against Arab citizens, and has openly called for the expulsion of disloyal citizens, mainly Arabs.
And his past convictions.
The report notes he was actually convicted in the past for racist incitement and for supporting a designated terrorist group, Khan's Karaf. It mentions he openly admires Baruch Goldstein, the Hebron Mosque mass murderer, and seeks to transform Israel into a theocracy based on a strict interpretation of Jewish law. His direct control over the police and prison services is highlighted as deeply concerning by human rights groups cited in the report.
Giving huge power to someone with that background.
Exactly. Then there's Bezalel Smotrich. He holds two key posts. Finance minister, controlling the state budget. He's also a minister within the defense ministry, specifically overseeing civilian affairs in the West Bank. He's from the Religious Zionism Party.
A very powerful combination of roles.
Immensely powerful. The report says he champions Jewish supremacy, wants full West Bank annexation, is openly anti-LGBTQ plus pre-tailed, and a strong advocate for the settler movement. He's the one who infamously called to wipe out the Palestinian town of Huwara after a settler rampage there.
I remember that comment caused outrage.
Yes. The report notes he even described himself as a fascist homophobe, seemingly proudly. And crucially, since October 7th, he has stated, according to the report, that it is morally justified to starve Gaza's population to achieve Israel's war aims. His dual role allows him to funnel state funds to settlements while also wielding significant authority over the lives of Palestinians in the occupied territories.
It's a stark picture of ideology meeting policy.
It is. The report mentions others, too. Avi Maoz, a deputy minister heading a unit for national Jewish identity from the fringe Noam party. He's described as staunchly anti-LGBTQ+, anti-feminist, anti-reform Judaism, seeking to restrict the law of return to exclude converts and opposing what he calls assimilation. He views LGBTQ+ people as a threat to the family and liberal values as malign foreign influences. And the report says he's working to embed these views into state education and culture.
Pushing a very specific, narrow view of Jewish identity.
Yes. May Golan, the Minister for the Advancement of Women, ironically perhaps, from Likud, noted for ultranationalist and anti-immigrant rhetoric. The report quotes her expressing pride in the ruins of Gaza and stating that every baby will tell their grandchildren what the Jews did, which illustrates a kind of deep-seated triumphalism and destruction, according to the analysis.
A shocking statement from a government minister.
And Amihai Eliyahu, the heritage minister from Ben-Gvir's Osma Yehudit, another Kahanist ultranationalist. He went as far as suggesting that dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza was one of the possibilities.
Which caused international condemnation, even if dismissed later as metaphorical.
Right. But the report includes it to underscore the extremist nature of voices now holding ministerial portfolios within the Israeli government. It's not just fringe bloggers saying these things.
It's normalized at the highest levels.
That's the report's point. It notes this historical trajectory of political violence within this ideological stream, from the pre-state terrorism of the Irgun and Lehi, which we discussed, through to the modern-day violence of the settler movement, things like price tag attacks, arson, even murder. This violence has been progressively normalized over decades.
And the presence of figures like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the cabinet is seen as a culmination.
Exactly. The report concludes this marks a critical turning point. It represents the state's official sanctioning, its embrace, of an ideology rooted in political violence and supremacy. When the minister in charge of the police, Ben-Gvir, is a convicted supporter of a terrorist group, and the minister with huge power over the West Bank, Smotrich, has called for a Palestinian town to be erased, the line between state-sanctioned military violence and extremist settler violence becomes dangerously blurred, the report argues.
Creating a climate of impunity.
Yes, creating a climate of impunity for settlers, signaling that their violent methods are not only tolerated, but are perhaps even aligned with the state's ultimate objectives. It's a very sobering analysis of the current political reality described in the report.
Absolutely.
Okay, so having understood the psychological drivers and the ideological capture of the state, as laid out in the report, the analysis then moves to apply a rigorous legal framework to the actions happening on the ground. This is where it directly addresses the question and the crime of genocide.
Yes, this section is absolutely central to the report's overall argument. It systematically evaluates the evidence coming out of Palestine, particularly Gaza since October 7th, against the precise legal definition of genocide under international law.
Remind us of the basis for that definition.
The cornerstone is the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This treaty was established, obviously, in the wake of the Holocaust, specifically to prevent what's often called the crime of crimes, aiming to ensure that such horrors would never be repeated.
Never again.
The embodiment of never again in law. Article 2 of this convention defines genocide. It requires two main elements: the commission of certain prohibited acts and the specific intent behind those acts.
Okay, so what are the acts?
Article 2 lists 5 specific types of acts, known as the actus reus, or the guilty act. Any one of these can constitute genocide if done with the right intent. They are A, killing members of the group.
Straightforward enough.
B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group.
Harm, not just killing.
Right. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
So making life impossible for the group.
Exactly, like through starvation or destroying essential infrastructure. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group.
Targeting the group's future.
Yes. And E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
5 specific categories of acts.
5 categories. But as you pointed out earlier, the critical element, the thing that really distinguishes genocide from other mass crimes, like war crimes or crimes against humanity, is the mental element, the specific intent, often called the dolus specialis in legal terms.
It's not enough that people from the group were killed, even in large numbers.
Correct. It's not just about the scale, though scale can be evidence. The law requires proof that the perpetrators acted with the specific intent to destroy that group, national, ethnical, racial, or religious, in whole or in part as such, meaning destroying them because of their group identity.
That sounds like a very high bar to prove legally. How can you prove intent?
It is a high threshold, but international courts have established that genocidal intent doesn't require, a signed confession or a secret memo explicitly stating our goal is genocide.
You don't need a smoking gun document necessarily.
Not necessarily. Intent can be inferred. It can be inferred from a wider pattern of conduct, the systematic nature of the violence, the existence of a state policy that leads to destruction, and crucially, the explicit statements of political and military leaders who direct the actions or shape the environment. The report dedicates significant attention to demonstrating how this inference can be made in this specific case.
Okay, so with that legal framework defined, what does the report detail as evidence for these prohibited acts, the actus reus in Palestine, particularly focusing on Gaza since October 7, 2023? It draws on UN info, human rights groups, reporting.
Right. It goes through the categories. First, under A, killing members of the group, the report states, quite starkly, that the military assault on Gaza has resulted in mass killings of Palestinians on an unprecedented scale and speed in modern warfare.
The death toll figures are astronomical.
They are. As of mid-2025, when the report likely compiled its data, the reported death toll had surpassed 57,000. And Gaza's health ministry consistently noted that the majority of victims are women and children. The report characterizes this not just as a high number, but as staggering casualties inflicted in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, pointing towards a pattern of potentially indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks that effectively target a significant portion of the civilian population. The sheer speed and volume of deaths is presented as a key indicator.
Okay, what about this second act, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm?
Beyond the sheer number killed, the report highlights the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have suffered life-altering injuries. It specifically mentions the thousands of children who have undergone amputations, often without adequate anesthesia or proper medical care, because the healthcare system itself has been systematically dismantled.
Unimaginable suffering.
Truly. And the report also stresses the profound psychological devastation inflicted on the entire population. Constant, relentless bombardment, repeated forced displacement, witnessing mass death of family and neighbors. This is described as inflicting severe and long-lasting mental harm on a societal scale.
And it mentions detainees, too.
Yes. Importantly, the report cites credible reports, including from established human rights organizations and even acknowledged in some U.S. State Department reporting, documenting systemic torture, widespread sexual violence, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment against thousands of Palestinian detainees, including children, held in Israeli prisons and makeshift detention camps since October 7th. This systematic abuse is presented as further evidence of causing serious bodily and mental harm to the group.
Okay, and the third category, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. This seems particularly relevant to the siege.
Absolutely. The report argues this is perhaps the most comprehensive and arguably undeniable aspect of what it calls the genocidal process unfolding in Gaza. Immediately following the October 7th attacks, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered that complete siege we mentioned earlier, explicitly cutting off access to electricity, no food, no water, no fuel for 2.3 million inhabitants. This wasn't subtle, it was a public directive.
A declaration of intent, almost.
That's how the report frames it. And the siege wasn't just declared, it has been systematically enforced. Israel has severely restricted and actively obstructed the entry of life-saving humanitarian aid, food, medicine, fuel. This has led directly, the report states, citing UN agencies and humanitarian groups, to a man-made famine.
Famine as a weapon of war.
Exactly. UN experts, the report notes, have explicitly described this deliberate starvation as a war crime and potentially an act of genocide, a tool intended to bring about the physical destruction of the group by making life itself unsustainable.
And it's not just the aid blockade, it's also destruction of infrastructure.
Yes, the report details how this deliberate starvation is coupled with the systematic destruction of the very foundations of life in Gaza. It cites figures like over 70% of all homes being damaged or destroyed, displacing virtually the entire population, often multiple times.
Nowhere left to live.
Essentially, every single university in Gaza has been demolished. The vast majority of hospitals have been damaged, destroyed, or rendered non-functional. Schools, bakeries, mosques, churches, all systematically targeted and destroyed, crippling essential services and cultural life.
Wiping out the means of existence.
That's the picture painted. The report concludes this section by referencing the assessment of the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, who concluded that these combined actions, the siege, the starvation, the destruction of homes, hospitals, universities, are clearly aimed at making Gaza unlivable. They are not merely unfortunate collateral damage of targeting militants, but rather calculated measures to destroy the conditions necessary for the Palestinian group's existence in Gaza. That distinction between collateral damage and calculated destruction is key in legal terms.
Okay, so those are the acts, the actus reus. This brings us back to the crucial question. If these are the acts being committed, how does the report demonstrate the specific intent, the dolus specialis, the intent to destroy the group as such?
Right, and the report argues quite powerfully that the case for genocidal intent in this specific situation doesn't rely solely on inference from the pattern of actions, as it might have to in other historical cases where direct evidence was hidden.
Why not?
Because, the report contends, there exists what it describes as a vast and chilling record of public statements made by Israeli officials at the highest levels of government and military command, especially in the weeks and months following October 7th.
The rhetoric we touched on earlier.
Exactly. These statements, which were extensively compiled in South Africa's submission to the ICJ and have been documented by numerous media outlets and human rights groups, are characterized by some scholars cited in the report as forming a poetics of genocide.
Poetics of genocide, meaning?
Meaning a public discourse, a shared language among officials that openly dehumanizes, calls for, and justifies the destruction of the Palestinian people in Gaza, particularly targeting the civilian population as a whole.
So these are not just isolated remarks, but a consistent pattern from the top. Can you give us some of the most direct and unambiguous examples highlighted in the report?
Absolutely. The report flags several as particularly damning evidence of intent. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as we discussed, explicitly invoked the biblical story of Amalek, telling his soldiers, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you." Given the genocidal context of that biblical command, the report characterizes this not as some obscure historical reference, but as a direct scriptural call for annihilation understood by his audience.
Using religious texts to signal intent.
That's the interpretation offered. Then there's President Isaac Herzog, often seen as a more moderate figure. On October 13, 2023, he declared that it's an entire nation out there that is responsible for the Hamas attacks, explicitly rejecting any distinction between militants and civilians. He added, "There are no innocent civilians in Gaza,"
declaring the entire population guilty.
effectively removing the protected status of 2.3 million people, the report argues. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's order for a complete siege against human animals is presented again here as a clear directive to the military, coming from the top, to treat the population of Gaza as subhuman and to inflict conditions of life aimed at their destruction. Clear intent, the report says.
And others. Smotrich.
Yes. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who stated that starving the 2 million people in Gaza is morally justified, and had previously called for the Palestinian town of Huwara to be wiped out. Agriculture Minister Avi Dichter, a former Shin Bet director, explicitly stated that the military campaign is unfolding as Gaza's Nakba, directly linking the current destruction to the original 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
Calling it a new Nakba.
Explicitly. And Nissim Vaturi, the deputy speaker of the Knesset from Likud, chillingly stated that Israel has one common goal: erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth.
Erasing Gaza. It's hard to interpret that any other way.
It's very direct. The report's analysis is that these are not isolated slips of the tongue, and not just unfortunate rhetorical flourishes in the heat of the moment. They represent a consistent pattern of dehumanizing and eliminationist rhetoric coming from the very officials directing the war. These statements provide a window into the intent behind the actions.
And under international law, this kind of speech itself is significant.
Hugely significant. According to international law, such direct and public incitement to commit genocide is itself a punishable act under Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. Furthermore, UN experts, as cited heavily in the report, have argued that Israel has been intentionally distorting the principles of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, or jus in bello,
How so?
in order to provide a kind of legalistic cover for its violence against civilians. For example, by declaring vast areas of Gaza as combat zones and issuing so-called evacuation orders to areas that are simultaneously being bombed or lack any basic necessities for survival.
Setting people up for failure, essentially.
That's the argument. Israel then creates a pretext to treat any civilians who remain in these evacuated zones, often because they are unable or unwilling to leave, as legitimate military targets, or as having forfeited their civilian protection. This practice, which some experts call de-civilianization, is framed by the report as an attempt to invert the language of law, using concepts like warning and distinction not to protect civilians, but actually to strip them of their protection and legitimize their killing on a mass scale.
That's a critical point about the potential twisting of legal language to facilitate rather than prevent harm.
It's a core part of the argument about intent manifesting through policy.
Okay, so what does all this mean when we zoom out and look at the bigger picture of the region's history, beyond just the events since October 7th? The report places the unfolding events within a broader framework, doesn't it? The settler-colonial framework.
Yes, and this is really a foundational lens for the entire report's analysis. It explicitly draws on scholarship, on settler colonialism, to understand the deeper structures at play. It describes settler colonialism not simply as a historical event that happened in the past, but as an ongoing structure.
A structure, not just an event.
Meaning it's a persistent social and political formation whose primary inherent logic is the elimination of the native. This is done to make way for the settler society to claim exclusive ownership and control over the land.
And elimination doesn't necessarily just mean physical killing, right?
Correct. The report clarifies, drawing on the work of scholars like Patrick Wolfe, that this elimination can take many forms. It can include physical extermination or genocide in the strictest sense, but also forced assimilation, destroying the native culture, ethnic cleansing, forcibly removing the population, or creating conditions that lead to the group's gradual disappearance or marginalization. The goal is always the removal of the indigenous presence as a distinct political and social entity challenging the settler claim.
And how does the report connect this historical consistency, this logic, specifically to the Zionist movement in Palestine?
The report explicitly connects this settler colonial logic to the history of the Zionist movement in Palestine, right from its early days. It points to early explicit calls among some Zionist thinkers for a Palestine without Arabs, and frames the 1948 Nakba, the mass expulsion, as a key moment where this eliminatory logic was violently enacted on a large scale.
So the current events aren't seen as entirely new, but fitting a pattern.
Within this framework, yes. Settler colonial regimes, the report argues, are understood to be structurally prone to what it calls genocidal moments or escalations. These tend to happen particularly when the regime encounters persistent organized resistance from the indigenous population. This resistance, from the settler colonial perspective, represents an intolerable challenge to their project of exclusive control and sovereignty over the land.
So resistance triggers elimination.
That's the dynamic described. The current unprecedented destruction of Gaza, therefore, is understood within this analysis not as an aberration, not as an unfortunate or excessive response to the Hamas attack, but rather as a violent and catastrophic acceleration of this long-term eliminatory project. It's framed as an attempt, perhaps seen by some in power as a final opportunity, to resolve the problem of indigenous Palestinian resistance, particularly from Gaza, once and for all, by making Gaza unlivable and eliminating the population's collective presence there.
A very grim interpretation of the goals.
Based on the settler colonial analysis, yes. And a pivotal moment in this crisis, as the report emphasizes repeatedly, was that legal finding by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, finding a plausible case that Israel is committing acts falling within the Genocide Convention in Gaza.
Why was that ruling so pivotal? Before that, the accusation was often dismissed by Israel and its allies as baseless or politically motivated or even anti-Semitic.
That's absolutely right. The provisional measures, ordered by the UN's highest court in January 2024 and reaffirmed and strengthened later, fundamentally transformed the nature of the international legal and political debate. The finding of plausibility, even though it wasn't a final judgment on guilt, established a judicially recognized risk of genocide. And that finding, critically, triggered a specific and binding legal obligation under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention for all signatory states.
Which is?
The duty to prevent genocide. This isn't just a moral obligation, it's a binding legal duty under the treaty. This ruling, the report concludes, essentially created a legal tripwire for the entire international community, especially for states closely allied with Israel.
How so? What changed for third-party states?
For third-party states, particularly those providing support to Israel, continuing to provide material aid like weapons or diplomatic cover, after this ruling, after being put on formal notice by the World Court of a plausible risk of genocide, is no longer merely a matter of political alignment or strategic interest. It becomes, arguably, a direct violation of their own solemn treaty obligations under the Genocide Convention. It raises the very real prospect of state responsibility for complicity in genocide.
Complicity. That's a serious charge against other states.
Extremely serious. The report highlights that this ruling puts a particularly sharp spotlight on the actions and policies of countries like the United States, given its role as Israel's primary backer.
Which leads us directly then to the third and final pillar of the report's analysis, the indispensable role of external support, or what it terms complicity. The scale of Israeli actions in Gaza, the report states flatly, couldn't possibly be sustained at their current intensity without the unwavering military, financial, and diplomatic support primarily, though not exclusively, from the United States.
Yes, this section really focuses on the role of the U.S. as the key enabler. And the report's striking insight here, as you mentioned, is applying the precise legal definition of complicity in genocide, which it argues the evidence suggests the U.S. meets.
So how is complicity defined legally? It's not the same as committing genocide directly.
No, it's distinct but related. Under international law, states can be held legally responsible not only for directly committing genocide, but also for being complicit in it. Article 3 of the Genocide Convention itself explicitly lists complicity in genocide as a punishable act.
Okay, but what does complicity actually mean in practice for a state?
The specifics have been clarified by the International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility and through the jurisprudence of international courts, like the ICJ in the Bosnian genocide case. Complicity, often described using the terms aiding and abetting, generally occurs when one state provides aid or assistance to another state with the knowledge that this assistance will be used by the receiving state to commit an internationally wrongful act, in this case, acts of genocide.
So the key is providing assistance with knowledge of how it will be used, not necessarily sharing the intent to commit genocide.
Exactly. That is the crucial legal distinction the report emphasizes. The standard for complicity, unlike for direct perpetration, requires knowledge of the wrongful act, not necessarily a shared specific intent, dolus specialis, with the primary perpetrator. It's generally sufficient that the assisting state's relevant organs were aware, or arguably should have been aware given the circumstances, that genocide or genocidal acts were about to be committed or were underway by the state they were assisting.
And the ICJ ruling plays a role here.
A critical role. The ICJ's January 2024 ruling, finding a plausible risk of genocide by Israel, legally put all state parties to the Genocide Convention, including the United States, on formal notice. Therefore, continuing to provide the means, the weapons, the funding, the diplomatic cover for Israel to conduct its military campaign in Gaza after this point, the report argues, is doing so with, at minimum, constructive knowledge and arguably actual knowledge of the plausible risk that those means will be used to further genocidal acts prohibited by the convention. This knowledge element fundamentally changes the legal calculus for complicity.
Okay, so let's unpack the specific arsenal of complicity the report describes, starting with the U.S.'s military and financial support. This is the aiding part of aiding and abetting.
Yes, providing the material means. The United States is, by a significant margin, Israel's largest and most important military supplier. This isn't new, but the report stresses that this support was dramatically accelerated and expanded after October 7, 2023. This flow of arms constitutes what the report calls the essential aiding component of complicity. The scale of this material support is vast, and the report stresses it has been absolutely essential to Israel's capacity to wage its campaign of destruction in Gaza at the intensity and duration we've seen.
Does the report quantify this support? Give us some numbers.
It does, and the figures are quite stark. For total U.S. spending related to Israel between October 2023 and September 2024 alone, the report estimates it was at least $22.76 billion. This includes $17.9 billion specifically designated as security assistance.
Nearly $23 billion in 1 year.
Yes. And on top of the regular aid, in April 2024, Congress passed an emergency supplemental funding package, which included another $3.5 billion in foreign military financing, FMF grants for Israel, plus $5.2 billion specifically for missile defense systems like Iron Dome and David's Sling. These figures alone, the report points out, demonstrate an unprecedented level of commitment to military aid during an active conflict with plausible findings of genocide.
And what about the actual weapons being sent? Does it detail those?
Yes, it gets quite specific, citing government data and investigative reports. It lists transfers including over 15,000 bombs and 57,000 artillery shells just in the initial months after October 7th. Crucially, this includes more than 1,800 Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs.
2,000-pound bombs, those are huge.
They are massive. They are notoriously indiscriminate when used in densely populated urban areas like those found throughout Gaza, capable of destroying entire apartment blocks. The report also lists over 500 Mk-82 500-pound bombs and GBU-39 small-diameter bombs. These were reportedly the type used in the controversial strike on the Tel al-Sultan tent camp for displaced people, causing a horrific fire. And also thousands of JDAM guidance kits, which convert these large, unguided dumb bombs into precision-guided munitions, though their devastating blast radius remains immense, especially for the 2,000-pound versions.
So the U.S. is supplying the specific heavy munitions being used to level Gaza.
That's the direct implication. And beyond munitions, the U.S. provided significant direct military and intelligence support. It deployed aircraft, carrier strike groups like the USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Dwight D. Eisenhower initially, and later the USS Abraham Lincoln, along with ballistic missile submarines like the USS Georgia, to the region a massive show of force-deterring regional actors. U.S. jets even provided direct air support to Israel, helping shoot down drones and missiles during Iran's retaliatory strike in April 2024, further deepening the direct military entanglement.
And financial support beyond military aid.
Yes. The report also mentions $9 billion in U.S. loan guarantees made available to Israel, making it easier for Israel to borrow money internationally. And it notes that U.S. state and local governments purchased some $1.7 billion in Israel bonds since October 7th, effectively loaning money to the Israeli government during the conflict.
Okay. So the report's analysis of all this material support, how does it connect it back to complicity?
The analysis is quite stark. This continuous and, in fact, expedited flow of weapons, particularly these thousands of massive 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs being used in dense urban settings, provides the direct physical means for the destruction unfolding in Gaza. The report cites human rights groups like Amnesty International, which documented the use of U.S.-made JDAMs in specific airstrikes that killed entire families and should, they argue, be investigated as war crimes.
So the U.S. knows its weapons are being used in potential war crimes.
The report argues that, given the ICJ ruling, the scale of destruction, the casualty figures, and the reports from human rights groups, the U.S. government knows, or certainly should know, how its weapons are being used. By continuing these transfers, despite overwhelming evidence of potential war crimes and a plausible risk of genocide, the United States, the report concludes, is knowingly providing the instruments of destruction. This isn't framed as a passive failure to prevent genocide, but rather as an active and material contribution to the commission of internationally wrongful acts. It moves beyond general political enablement, the report argues, into the territory of direct material complicity under international law.
That's a very strong claim about the legal responsibility.
It is. And building on that, the report argues it's not just about the weapons and the money, it's also about the diplomatic environment that the U.S. creates, which enables these actions to continue without consequence. This is the abetting or encouragement component of complicity.
The diplomatic shield, how does that work in practice?
The most obvious manifestation, the report details, is at the United Nations Security Council. The United States has repeatedly used its veto power, a privilege held by only 5 permanent members, to block resolutions aimed at halting the violence in Gaza.
So the report sees these Security Council vetoes as more than just, standard diplomatic maneuvering between great powers.
Far more. The pattern of U.S. vetoes, which the report thoroughly documents, is presented as demonstrating a consistent, deliberate policy of obstructing international efforts to enforce a ceasefire, demand accountability, and ensure adequate humanitarian aid.
Can you give an example of the kind of resolution vetoed and the justification given?
Sure. The report references a clear pattern. For instance, it might describe a hypothetical but typical scenario, like a June 4, 2025 veto, using an example date, on a resolution drafted by, say, Algeria or another non-permanent member demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, the release of all hostages held by Hamas and others, and unhindered humanitarian aid access throughout Gaza. The stated U.S. justification for vetoing such resolutions often follows a familiar script. The resolution fails to explicitly condemn Hamas, or it does not call for Hamas to disarm, or imposing a ceasefire would undermine ongoing sensitive diplomatic efforts led by the U.S.
Excuses that prevent action, essentially.
That's how the report frames them. Each veto, it argues, sends an unambiguous message to the Israeli government. You can continue your military campaign, however devastating, without fear of binding international consequences imposed by the Security Council. This diplomatic cover, there, functions as a powerful form of encouragement. It signals that the U.S. will protect Israel from the very international legal system it helped create after World War II, effectively granting it a unique form of immunity not afforded to other states.
And this shielding extends beyond the UN to international courts as well.
Yes, the report argues this policy of shielding Israel extends to direct attacks on international legal institutions themselves when they attempt to investigate or scrutinize Israeli actions.
Such as?
U.S. officials, including the President and Secretary of State, publicly condemned South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ as meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever before the court had even ruled, and even after the court found the case plausible.
Dismissing the World Court's findings.
Yes. The U.S. also argued before the ICJ, in separate proceedings concerning the legality of the occupation, that Israel should not be unconditionally ordered to end its decades-long occupation, and, incredibly, that Israel is not legally obligated under international humanitarian law to allow UN aid agencies like UNRWA, the main relief agency for Palestinians, to operate in Gaza, despite the unprecedented humanitarian crisis.
Actively arguing against aid access in court.
According to the report's account of the legal arguments made. Furthermore, the U.S. government has imposed sanctions, including visa bans and potential financial penalties, on officials of the International Criminal Court, ICC, a separate court that prosecutes individuals specifically for investigating the actions of Israel and its personnel alongside those of Hamas. This, the report characterizes, as a direct assault on the independence and integrity of international justice, aimed at deterring accountability for powerful states and their allies.
So, taken together, the weapons, the vetoes, the attacks on courts. The report sees this as a deliberate strategy, not just inertia or negligence.
Absolutely. The report concludes that the United States' comprehensive support for Israel is not an oversight, not a failure to act based on ignorance or indifference. It is presented as a calculated geopolitical choice. The U.S. government is knowingly sustaining Israel's military campaign, prioritizing its long-standing strategic alliance with Israel and its own perceived geopolitical interests in the Middle East, things like countering Iran, maintaining a dominant military partner in the region over its binding legal obligations under the Genocide Convention and general principles of international law.
And the war on terror framing helps justify this choice.
That's presented as the strategic justification often used publicly. Framing the conflict primarily as a war on terror against Hamas allows, the report argues, for actions that might otherwise be seen as grossly disproportionate or illegal under international law to be presented as permissible, even necessary, regardless of the catastrophic cost to civilian life or the constraints of IHL and human rights law. It provides a discursive cover.
What does the report warn about the long-term consequences of this U.S. policy of alleged complicity?
The long-term consequences, as the report warns, are profound and potentially catastrophic, not just for Palestinians, but for the entire international system. By providing virtually unconditional support for an ally that is plausibly committing genocide, while simultaneously attacking the very international institutions designed to ensure accountability, like the ICJ and ICC, the United States is actively eroding the post-World War II international legal order that it, ironically, helped build.
How is it eroding it?
It signals to the entire world that international law is not a universal standard based on principle, but rather a tool of power politics applicable only to adversaries and weaker states, but not to the U.S. itself or its powerful allies. This, the report argues, fundamentally undermines the very concept of a rules-based international order, replacing it with an order based more on brute force and impunity for the strong. It sets an incredibly dangerous precedent for future atrocities to be committed elsewhere with impunity, knowing that powerful backers can shield perpetrators from consequences. It risks rendering the promise of never again utterly meaningless.
A very stark warning about the stakes involved.
Indeed. It frames the situation in Palestine as a defining test for the credibility of the entire international legal system.
Okay. So, pulling all these threads together, what does this all mean for us as we try to understand this immensely complex and tragic situation? This comprehensive report, the triad of annihilation, Genocide in Palestine, has sought to demonstrate, through its analysis, that the catastrophe unfolding is the product of a devastating triad of forces, with each element reinforcing the others.
A convergence of factors.
Yes. First, there's that psychological architecture the report identified, built on moral disengagement, group narcissism, profound dehumanization, all amplified by the political weaponization of competing collective traumas like the Holocaust and the Nakba. This, the report argues, created the social and military environment where mass atrocity became, in its view, psychologically permissible.
Laying the groundwork.
Second, this psychological environment, according to the report's narrative, allowed a specific far-right political ideology, one rooted in the supremacist and eliminationist tenets of revisionist Zionism and, more recently, Kahanism, to effectively capture the Israeli state apparatus, transforming once fringe ideas into official government policy, particularly under the strategic facilitation of Benjamin Netanyahu.
The ideology taking power.
And finally, this entire destructive project, as the report contends, is enabled, sustained, and shielded by the crucial complicity of the United States, which provides the essential military firepower, the financial resources, and the diplomatic cover that allows the violence to continue at such scale and intensity, arguably in direct contradiction to its own legal obligations under international law.
The external enabler completing the triad.
Right. The evidence presented throughout the report, from the explicit, dehumanizing statements of Israeli leaders to the systematic destruction of life, homes, hospitals, and infrastructure in Gaza, to the deliberate obstruction of aid leading to famine, all supports the conclusion reached independently by the International Court of Justice and numerous legal and human rights experts, that there are reasonable grounds to believe the crime of genocide is being committed against the Palestinian people in Gaza. The convergence of these three elements, psychological readiness, ideological directive, and external enablement, has, the report concludes, created a terrifyingly effective, self-reinforcing system of annihilation.
A devastating conclusion based on their analysis, which leads us, I suppose, to the inevitable and important question. What can be done? Based on the insights and analysis presented in this report, what does it propose as pathways forward?
That's the crucial next step. The report does propose both immediate pathways aimed at accountability and halting the violence, and longer-term strategies focused on dismantling the underlying structures of violence.
Okay, let's start with the immediate actions. What does the report call for right now?
For immediate actions, the report calls for all states, but particularly the United States and European nations, given their influence in arms supplies, to impose an immediate and comprehensive two-way arms embargo. That means halting weapon transfers to Israel, but also to Palestinian armed groups like Hamas. The argument is clear. Continuing to supply weapons to a state plausibly committing genocide is a direct violation of the duty to prevent genocide under the Convention.
Stop fueling the fire.
Essentially. It also demands the full and immediate implementation of all the ICJ's provisional measures orders, especially ensuring unhindered humanitarian aid access throughout Gaza to end the engineered famine and prevent further mass death from starvation and disease. This isn't a request. It's framed as a legal obligation stemming from the ICJ orders.
What about accountability for individuals?
Yes. The report calls for targeted sanctions, things like asset freezes and travel bans, to be imposed on specific Israeli officials who have been identified as inciting genocide or as having command responsibility for orchestrating war crimes. It explicitly suggests figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, and Yoav Gallant as potential targets for such sanctions based on their public statements and roles.
Holding individuals accountable.
And crucially, it urges all states to provide full political and financial support to the ongoing legal proceedings at both the International Court of Justice, which deals with state responsibility, and the International Criminal Court, which prosecutes individuals. It calls for active resistance against any attempts by states, including explicitly the United States, to intimidate, sanction, or defund these courts for investigating Israeli actions. It also suggests that national courts should pursue prosecutions of individuals responsible for atrocity crimes under the principle of universal jurisdiction wherever possible.
Strengthening international justice mechanisms.
Exactly. Yeah. Protecting them and using them. But beyond these immediate crisis measures, the report stresses that even a ceasefire, while urgently necessary, will be totally insufficient on its own to secure a just and lasting peace. The root causes identified throughout the report, the occupation, the ideology, the inequality must be addressed.
So what are the longer-term strategies it proposes for dismantling the structure of violence?
This requires, the report argues, a fundamental shift in the international community's entire approach to the conflict. First and foremost, it means ending the 57-year military occupation of Palestinian territories, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, which is illegal under international law, and is described by the report as the foundational context, the incubator, for much of the violence and suffering. A complete and unconditional end to the occupation is presented as an absolute prerequisite for any meaningful peace.
Addressing the occupation directly.
Yes. Secondly, it calls for dismantling the system of racial domination and oppression that leading human rights organizations, including Israeli ones like B'Tselem, as well as international ones like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, have analyzed and concluded meets the legal definition of apartheid. This means ensuring full and equal rights for all people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. Ending systemic discrimination.
Tackling the apartheid analysis head on.
Right. Thirdly, it argues for directly addressing the legacy of settler colonialism and the historical injustices of the 1948 Nakba. This includes, controversially but based on international law, recognizing and implementing the right of return for Palestinian refugees, as stipulated in UN General Assembly Resolution 194, addressing the foundational dispossession.
Dealing with the historical root causes.
And finally, flowing from the complicity analysis, the report argues for a fundamental reevaluation and transformation of U.S. policy towards Israel. This means shifting away from the current paradigm of unconditional military, financial, and diplomatic support towards a policy that is firmly grounded in accountability to international law, universal human rights principles, and the pursuit of justice and equality for both Palestinians and Israelis. Conditioning aid on compliance with law.
A radical shift in U.S. policy being called for.
A fundamental shift, yes. And the report concludes with a really provocative thought, a kind of final warning for the listener and the world. It concludes that the entire post-World War II international order, painstakingly built on the promise of never again in the wake of the Holocaust, now faces perhaps its most defining test in Palestine. Failure by the international community, particularly powerful states, to act decisively in the face of plausible genocide, it argues, would not only condemn the Palestinian people to further destruction, but would also render the entire framework of international law and human rights essentially meaningless. It would signal that these are just words, not enforceable principles, ushering in potentially a new and dangerous era of global impunity where might makes right truly prevails.
It's a profoundly sobering thought to end on. A challenge, really.
It really is. It certainly encourages us all, I think, to continue our own exploration of these incredibly important, difficult topics and to ask ourselves what it truly means to uphold universal principles, like the prevention of genocide in our complex and often brutal world.